Hey, this is Bryce and thanks for tuning into my YouTube channel, Jack of Trades. In this video, I want to go over a lot that I recently picked up off of eBay, which included an RC10 car, a Futaba Magnum radio, and a box of parts for a Mugen Bulldog 2. Originally what drew me to the auction was the controller and the Mugen Bulldog 2 parts box. The RC10 didn't really draw my attention. On any given day, there's quite a few listings for used RC10s, and upon first glance and just the limited photos, this didn't really look interesting. So I went ahead and sent a message to the seller to ask him for some more photos of the RC10 with the body off, bottom of the chassis, kind of the typical photos that you would expect. I don't really think he knew anything about the car or the parts or the controller. So he wasn't very helpful in that sense. But anyways, upon seeing pictures, this car became very interesting to me. So I bid hard and fast, and I won the lot, obviously, and I received it. The car is in great condition for its age. I was very disappointed with the Mugen parts because for whatever reason the seller lost like half the parts that he was showing in photos in the auction. Maybe half is exaggerating, but at least a third to half of the parts didn't show up with the box of parts. And that was very, very frustrating because I have the Mugen Bulldog 2, and I wanted to restore it, and basically there was like a 90% complete kit in that box of parts for Mugen Bulldog 2. And then I went to try to, let me preface this. Whenever I buy RC electronics on eBay, I assume that they don't work. There's never an assumption that the electronics are gonna work. That being said, 99% of the time the electronics work, which is kind of nice. You can almost bet on it, but you shouldn't bet on it. But I've probably bought over 100 used speed controllers, and I've had 2 that didn't work. So that's 98% that work, which is, if you can get lots of speed controllers, I'm talking ESCs, for $10 a pop, then that's a pretty good deal, where you're only having to throw away 2. Same with radios. Most of the radios typically work. Unfortunately, the radio that came with this, so this is one of those Futaba Magnum Seniors, or the FP-T3PG. Can you see that? It didn't work out of the box, and so I've taken it apart. I'm kind of working through troubleshooting it right now. And it's just something I do. I'll spend 5 minutes here and there working it out. I think it's a power thing and just getting power to certain parts of the radio, probably just due to kind of corroded contacts, oxidized contacts over the years. Worst case, if it doesn't work, there's a lot of hardware in here that I could use on my other 3PG radio, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that one. The Mugen stuff, again, I kind of missed out on a third of the parts because the seller claimed that he basically gave the box to the shipper, and the shipper didn't ship everything. Whatever, they're lost. There's nothing I can do about it. He rectified the situation by sending me some other parts for a different car, as well as giving me a partial refund on the auction. But that kind of doesn't, I really wanted those parts because these parts are really hard to find, but the car makes up for it. It turns out this car ended up being Early-Mid Edinger RC10 with vintage Hopups. Every aspect of this car is hard to find. I wouldn't call it a unicorn because when I get into RC10s, I don't get into kind of the unique builds, the Masami builds, or the MIP 4-wheel drive builds. Those are kind of way out of my category. I'm more into the vintage stock RC10s. That being said, this is my oldest RC10 that I have in my collection, and I have an Edinger new in box kit, but this is an early Edinger car. And what I would like to do is kind of flip the camera around and go into the details in how do you identify an RC10 as an early Edinger. They're only made for a couple of years. Edinger is basically the address, the first address where RC10s or Team Associated started producing RC10s. And you can see that on the box. It's Soci Electronics, 1928 East Edinger, Santa Ana, California. So that is the address where they first started producing RC10s. And they did that from 1984 to 1986. Then in 1986, they moved to the Cadillac location. So you've got Edinger RC10s and Cadillac RC10s. And this is an early Edinger RC10. And there's, well, early to mid. I mean, we're talking 2-year window. So early to mid, I'll accept the mid. But there are a lot of indicators that would suggest this is an early Edinger. And I'd like to go ahead and flip the camera around and go into some of those details, because it's a healthy list of parts that distinguish this as an early Edinger car, or early to mid Edinger car. So I'll go and flip the camera around. Thanks for tuning in and watching the video. I appreciate your time. Alright, so let's dig into this RC10, determine what makes this an early to mid Edinger car. First off, let's start with the box. So the early Edinger boxes, well, first, any Edinger box is denoted by the Soci Electronics address, 1928 East Edinger. What denotes an early Edinger box is the stamp on the end of the box. So we've got the kit number, price, complete kit, but this is a stamp on the box versus a printed label that was slapped onto the side. This box didn't actually come with that lot, but I happen to have this box in my collection. It came with another car that wasn't necessarily an Edinger car, but if I get a vintage box, I will keep it, but I refuse to pay anything for an actual box. So I will never go out and buy a box, but I will keep boxes that are deemed collectible. And I use them. I put stuff in them because I don't have space for empty boxes. So this car will live in this box until I get around to restoring it, at which point it'll become a shelf queen. The lot did come with some extra parts. So we got an extra set of rear wheels with some Italian-made tires. I don't know who makes these tires. If you know, give me a shout out. The original tires that were on the car when it was delivered are obviously shot. They were obviously sitting on a shelf, and they kind of rotted out, dried out, cracked. So those are throwaway tires. However, there was another set of older vintage tires in great shape. They are a little hard. We might try to soften these up a little bit, clean them up, soften them up, and get them mounted to the original wheels. We also have an extra set of front wheels. These are, I guess, 5 rib, or maybe actually they look like 7 ribs that have been trimmed down. And that gets us into what is an early Edinger car. One of the things to denote is the early to mid Edingers were 7 ribs on the front, where basically you had 2 halves with a seam in the middle, and this could have been a 7 rib where it's been trimmed in the middle. The early Edingers had Goodyear embossed on the sidewall of the tire. These are blank, but these still classify as early to mid Edinger tires because of the fact that they're 7 ribs. And actually, so before we go on, so we have an extra wing as well. We have an extra gear cover. I need to look up to see what the vintage is on this gear cover. I have yet to find pictures of it, but I haven't dug too hard for that. And then this driver figure, which has nothing to do with an RC10, I don't believe. It's been chopped up. It was originally mounted in the car, but the early Edingers didn't come with the Clear Lexan driver figures. If you go over to rc10talk.com, they have a great thread called 25 Years of the RC10, where they kind of go over every little detail of different eras of RC10s and the differences to help you identify what what kind of era your RC10 came from. I'm aware of that thread, and I've kind of used it as a guide when I'm looking at RC10s that might be interesting. It's very useful. So I highly recommend checking that out if you are looking to buy an RC10 and don't know what exactly you're about to get yourself into. We already went over the box. Tires, so we talked about the tires. So the tires that were mounted to the car are the 7-rib tires. So these are nice to haves. I think this is my first set of 7-rib tires. And then we get into the wing buttons. The early Edinger cars had the diamond wing buttons versus the teardrop shaped wing buttons. So we actually have 2 wings with the diamond wing buttons. These unfortunately are pretty deformed. They're curved up, kind of following the profile. Actually, I don't know why they're curved up. It's kind of odd. Being that it's nylon, maybe we can boil this and flatten it out. I don't know. I'll have to do some research. I don't want to damage these any more than they are. You know, if it turns out I can't kind of smooth it out or flatten it out, I'll just leave them as is. These are a little bit better shape. They're a little more flat. At least this one is. This one's still curved. So let's pull that wing off and we can get into the car. What else? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and take the body off. This isn't an original body, but it's a very cool body. I like this body. I like the fact that it has this little rear foil on the back of it. If you know what style body this is, let me know. Otherwise, I'll have to do some research to figure it out. Now, I'd like to get a reproduction body like this if possible. I'm sure Team Blue Group probably makes one. Or, who's the other one? Yeah, Penguin RC also makes RC10 bodies. But it's a cool body. It's in pretty good shape. There's the typical cracking around the cutouts for the shock tower, but it's not excessive. Where it would be a good runner body, kind of a good vintage runner body, and definitely worth touching up the paint on and cleaning up. So, other indicators that this is an early Edinger. Early, I say early, but I mean early to mid Edinger. What's interesting is this doesn't have the typical gold pan chassis, and that's kind of what, you know, the selling point, the quote-unquote selling point for these cars is the gold pan chassis. But this is an early representation with vintage Hopups. So the Hopups with the chassis and the shock towers are these graphite plates with a so I actually posted photos of this onto the RC10 Talk Facebook page, and I got some information on some of these parts because I'm not too familiar with kind of the nuances of the era when it comes to vintage parts. So the chassis and the shock towers are graphite with a cork core, and I guess that's kind of somewhat rare. I've seen it on other cars like the Losis, but it's a fairly uncommon composite. The original company that was making these parts was D&D Graphite, who later became Composite Craft, and they actually made parts for Parma. Parma, I think we know as making bodies, but they also made Hopups, and actually all of the Hopup, well, most of the Hopups on this car are Parma. So we've got the Parma heatsink, and these are all vintage to the era of the car. We've got the Parma heatsink, Parma sway bars in the front and rear. And you can tell that they're aftermarket just because of how the linkage is done. The associated sway bars were rod ends on both sides, whereas Parma uses, it almost looks like hardware from RC airplanes. The linkage stuff that you'd find in an RC airplane, it probably was. But that's kind of the designator for that. And then people said that the chassis is also Parma. However, getting back to D&D Graphite, which became Composite Craft, they actually made, it looked like they made parts for Parma. The one indicator that makes this a D&D Graphite instead of Parma is that there's a single set of mounting holes on the rear shock tower, whereas the Parma shock tower had two mounting holes or positions for the shocks. So this is definitely D&D, and I would guess that because this is D&D, that the front is also D&D, because these actually came as one piece with a little nub to tie them together, then you would trim it out and basically break it into two pieces. But because you have the shock towers that are D&D, more than likely the chassis is also D&D, but I don't have confirmation on that. So getting back to the RC10 or team associated parts that designate this a early to mid Edinger, we get into the rear shock cups. In the kind of Edinger Cadillac era, these will be non-slotted cups, but the early Edingers are these cups that kind of house the spring, and the spring sits within a recessed portion of that cup. And this is the only car that I have that has these cups, and that was one of the things that I saw in the photos that kind of raised the red flag that these are interesting. This is an interesting car. The graphite chassis, I knew that the white core, I didn't know it was cork at the time, but the white core I know is kind of an indicator of something interesting from that time. And then moving along the car, so the front spring cups are also not slotted. And what that means is basically as you assemble these shocks, you already have to have the springs on there, whereas a modern shock, these cups are removable and you can take the springs on and off pretty quickly. Here you have to unscrew the rod end on the end of the shock shaft to get it off. Other indicators, let's see here. The front spindles, it's going to be hard to tell. Alright, so we can see here there's kind of this notch here. There's less material on this arm, and later on they added material here to strengthen up this the arm for the spindle. The battery straps, early Edingers had G10 battery straps, as we see here. So on early Edinger RC10s, the bell cranks are identical on the left and right side. On a newer RC10, your bell crank looks like this on the right side. I'm sorry, on the left side. And then on this one, it's just this thin blade without this oval piece of plastic around it. And that's kind of another indicator to watch out for. But that's easy to fake as well. I would never buy an RC10 off eBay that was advertising it as an early Edinger RC10. Because A, they could have faked it by just piecing a bunch of stuff together, or if it is legit, it's going to draw a lot of attention and the auction is probably going to get really expensive really fast. What I look for is RC10s that have been mislabeled or the owner doesn't know what they have. So a lot of times the listing doesn't even list it as an RC10, it lists it as a vintage RC car. So that's what I look for. And that only gets you so far. This auction actually went for really, it should have gone for probably twice as much as it did. I got a really good deal on it. I didn't even by the end of the auction, I didn't fully understand or appreciate what I had managed to snag up on eBay. The gear cover is also unique for the early Edingers. It's a fairly thin plastic and it has this particular shape to it. And I actually have that extra gear cover, which I need to figure out what vintage that is. I haven't touched this car since I received it, but there's indicators inside the gearbox as well as inside the shocks that kind of denote the era of the car. Another thing on the early Edingers was the style of the wiper arm for the speed controller. So this is a Parma style here versus the newer ones are slightly different in design. And I think the last major one is the rod ends on the links. A lot of the links are all around. They're full circles versus having a hex. It looks like the steering links might have been replaced at one point because they're half round, half hex. So it's hex here, and it's hex here, and it's round here. And that was kind of later Edinger Cadillac. That was the kind of later Edinger Cadillac style links. But the full round are early Edinger rod ends, and that's about it. So this is a diamond in the rough. I wasn't drawn to the auction by it, and I didn't win the auction because of it. I was more into the Bulldog stuff. And then as far as the condition of the car, the car is in excellent shape. There's very little wear. You know, you've got a couple of scratches, and this is like a couple of runs. You don't even have wear on. Usually on the rear of the chassis here, you'll see it's starting to wear and work through the layers of the composite. But we just got a couple of scratches here. This is probably a couple of runs at the most. And you know, it's in great shape. You've got this little bumper up front, which looks to have protected the front of the chassis. I haven't even pulled this off, but I can only assume that it's in pretty good shape. So this is, you know, this is a great rendition of a early vintage RC10. Granted, it doesn't have the original gold pan chassis, but it's got parts on it that are arguably more rare than those gold pan chassis. So I'm really happy with this. It definitely makes up for those missing bolt lug parts. I will eventually, you know, this will get into the queue, but this will get stripped down, cleaned, and put back together. I probably won't do much to it because it is in such great shape. I might try to find some new arms. The arms look a little worn, so I might look for some original arms if I can. If not, no big deal. The car is what it is. It's a great representation of an earlier RC10. I do want to get a new body for it. I'll keep this one, get a new one, and try to paint it up. That's all I got. Thank you for tuning in and watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the videos and you keep coming back to them. Take care. Bye.